The silence that followed betrayal was always louder than the act itself. It didn't matter how many tears were shed or how many nights passed in restless loops of questioning. The damage had been done, the foundation cracked, and no amount of time could seal the fracture. I learned this not from books or advice, but from the moment I stood in a room filled with laughter that didn't include me, realizing I had been made the fool. My absence in their shared smiles was not a coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated erasure. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I walked out of that space and into a world that suddenly looked unfamiliar. The sidewalk felt longer, the air thicker, and my own reflection looked like a stranger. I stared into my eyes and saw someone I didn't recognize, someone who had handed over her trust so freely, only to have it weaponized. They had expected rage. They had anticipated confrontation. What they didn't account for was my silence, my stillness, the cold clarity that replaced the initial sting. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the seconds crawl by on the digital clock beside my bed, each blink a beat of restraint. The world outside had no idea what had happened, and I liked it that way. I didn't need validation. I didn't want pity. I wanted precision. The days that followed were filled with routine, smiles at work, polite nods at neighbors, casual small talk with acquaintances. No one suspected a thing. But beneath it all, beneath the mask, something ancient stirred. I had given everything, stood beside them through hardship, defended them when others doubted, sacrificed when no one asked me to. And they had chosen someone else, someone temporary, someone who didn't know their darkest fears or quiet dreams. I replayed the moments leading up to it all like a broken film reel. The skipped dinners, the excuses, the subtle shift in tone. It had been there all along, and I had chosen blindness. My fault. That was the first truth I accepted. But it would also be the last one I took responsibility for. Revenge wasn't about justice, it was about reclaiming control. I didn't want them to hurt the way I had. I wanted them to crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. I wanted them to question every decision, every moment, every whisper. I wanted them to lie awake at night, wondering when the consequences would come. And they would never see it coming. The planning became my sanctuary. I studied every move, every pattern, every weakness. I learned where they found their joy, what they valued most, who they trusted. I took my time, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted perfection. There would be no chaos in my path, only calculation. It began with distance. I cut ties slowly, subtly. I withdrew from shared spaces, let the conversations grow cold, allowed the silence between us to deepen. They thought I was hurting, that I was licking wounds. They never imagined I was observing, documenting, waiting. Information was power. I gathered it through smiles and nods, through old contacts and casual inquiries. No one questioned me. I was the one who had been wronged after all. Everyone pitied me, and that pity became my camouflage. I let them believe I was healing. In truth, I was sharpening. They had secrets. Everyone does. But theirs were particularly fragile. Missteps, quiet scandals, small acts of cruelty hidden beneath charm. It wasn't difficult to uncover them. It was almost disappointing how easy it was. I documented everything, cataloged it meticulously, waited for the right time. But revenge is more than just exposing secrets. It's about timing. It's about precision. I didn't want a dramatic explosion. I wanted erosion, slow, quiet, devastating. I wanted to dismantle the life they built one piece at a time, so that when they looked around, nothing remained intact. The first strike was imperceptible. A whisper in the right ear. A nudge toward doubt. It took root slowly, like rot in a beam, weakening the structure without drawing attention. I watched from the shadows as tension grew in their lives, as smiles grew forced, as trust began to waver. They didn't suspect me. That was the brilliance of it all. The second move was financial. I knew where the vulnerabilities were. Hidden spending, poor decisions, undisclosed debts. I didn't need to steal. I simply illuminated the truth and let it speak for itself. A concern call here, a subtle tip there. Before long, their stability began to buckle. And still, I remained unseen. They believed their downfall was due to misfortune, maybe karma, maybe just bad timing. They never looked in my direction. Why would they? I had disappeared from their life quietly, gracefully. They thought I was healing. They thought I was gone. But I was everywhere. I infiltrated their circle not by force but by proximity. I became indispensable to people they had neglected, befriended those they underestimated, offered my presence where theirs had grown unreliable. Bit by bit, I rewrote the story of who they were in the minds of others. Not with lies, just carefully curated truths. Soon, invitations that once had their name no longer arrived. Opportunities slipped through their fingers. Praise turned to polite dismissal. They became the person people warned others about, the one who took too much and gave too little. And through it all, I said nothing. I watched them begin to unravel, trying to understand what had shifted. They tried to win back old allies, mend relationships they had taken for granted. But trust, once broken, rarely returns whole. And they had no idea why the world they once ruled now seemed to recoil. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not guilt. Just quiet. The final piece was personal. The one thing they still held on to. Their illusion of control, of superiority. I shattered it with a single, undeniable truth. I let them see the full extent of what I knew, of what I had done. Not through confrontation. Not with fury. Just a quiet message, left where they couldn't ignore it. No signature. No explicación. Just evidence. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't mine, it was theirs. And it was deafening. It didn't happen all at once, and that was the point. Erosion is not an event, it's a process. It eats away silently, without spectacle, until what once seemed solid collapses into dust. I wanted that collapse. Not a single, resounding crash, but the slow realization that the foundation was gone. That nothing could be rebuilt because the rot had reached too deep. They stopped smiling in photos first. The brightness dulled, the light in their eyes dimmed. The world around them hadn't changed, but their position in it had. Friends grew scarce. Opportunities dried up. Whispers filled the spaces where praise once echoed. Still, they clung to the illusion of stability, as if denial could substitute for control. I didn't watch with glee. I watched with discipline. Emotion was the enemy now. Revenge isn't personal after the planning stage. It's not about rage or sorrow anymore. It's about execution. They tried to reinvent themselves. I expected it. New clothes, new causes, new acquaintances, like a snake shedding skin, hoping the damage would disappear with the molt. But reinvention only works when the past hasn't been poisoned. Every room they entered carried shadows now, invisible to others, but blinding to them. Every smile directed their way was laced with suspicion. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. They began to second-guess even kindness. I reached out once, indirectly. Not to connect. Not to gloat. Just to remind them of my presence. A shared acquaintance, an overheard comment, a familiar phrase slipped into conversation. Just enough to reignite the paranoia. I wanted them to feel the ground beneath them shift every time they thought they had found stability. I didn't need to haunt their home. I only had to live in their mind. Their new friends never stayed long. I didn't have to intervene. They self-destructed all on their own. When your reputation carries the scent of rot, people learn to walk away before they catch the disease. Even the ones who lingered out of pity did so with distance, as if they knew some unspoken truth they couldn't quite voice. I made sure of that. Work became a battlefield. The cracks I had helped expose grew deeper. Performance declined. Blame circulated, and the mask of confidence began to slip. I knew exactly which threads to pull. Discreet emails, subtle nudges, timely reminders of past oversights. Each one designed not to destroy, but to destabilize. They made their own mistakes after that. I simply ensured they were seen. I watched as frustration turned inward. They lashed out. Not at me, never at me, but at everyone else. The more they struggled to maintain control, the more they revealed how little they had. There were outbursts, then apologies, then silence. Eventually, even silence became too loud. They started vanishing from gatherings entirely, afraid of the looks, the tension, the unspoken judgment. By then, no one reached for them the way they used to. No one covered for their absences. No one defended them in whispered conversations. Isolation came not from exile, but from exhaustion. People were tired of the drama, tired of the excuses. I didn't have to convince anyone. They did that for me. I kept my distance, always just out of reach. They never knew when I might appear. At a gallery, a charity event, a mutual friend's dinner. I never spoke to them. Never looked too long. Just enough to exist in their periphery, like a phantom. It was enough to make their hands tremble when they thought they were alone. I had become the question they couldn't answer. The message I left, the one that revealed the depth of my knowledge, had changed everything. It hadn't said what I wanted. It didn't have to. They had filled in the blanks themselves. That was the real power of silence. When someone realizes they've been seen fully and deeply, with all their secrets laid bare, it breaks something fundamental in them. It did in them. They tried to trace the damage, to undo it. I could feel it. Attempts to reconcile with old contacts, to prove themselves again, to rebuild what had already turned to ash. It was too late. The house was gone. Only smoke remained. I focused next on what they feared most, obscurity. For someone so dependent on validation, nothing cuts deeper than being overlooked. I took the spotlight they once stood in and dimmed it slowly, not by stealing it, but by shifting it elsewhere. I raised up others in their place, celebrated voices they had silenced, supported people they had ignored. With every rising figure, their relevance waned. It wasn't cruelty. It was balance. I had once lived in their shadow, unseen, unheard. I had swallowed pride, dismissed my own instincts, contorted myself to be acceptable. That part of me no longer existed. And the space I now occupied had been carved through quiet resilience. I never needed revenge to make me whole. But it made things right. There were moments I wondered if they suspected. Not that it mattered. Even if they knew, they couldn't stop it. They had forfeited that chance the moment they chose betrayal over loyalty. And if they didn't know, then the punishment was even more exquisite, being haunted by a ghost they couldn't name. I saw them again once up close. Not planned. A coincidence, perhaps. Or maybe fate. They looked smaller. Not physically, but energetically, like a house with the lights off. The vibrance was gone. The posture of arrogance had collapsed into something defensive. Their eyes scanned the room constantly, waiting for judgment that never needed to be spoken aloud. I didn't speak. I didn't even acknowledge them. But I stood tall, unflinching, unshaken. I let them see the life I now lived, peaceful, respected, untouchable. And in that silent exchange, something passed between us. The final confirmation that I had won. But there was no celebration. No thrill. Just stillness. Because revenge, once complete, leaves behind an echo. It doesn't fill you. It empties you of what once consumed you. And in that hollow space, something new grows. Not joy, not pride, but peace. And for me, that was enough. The aftermath of revenge is not as sharp-edged as the path leading to it. It is quieter, more subdued, like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire has consumed everything in its reach. It doesn't roar, it whispers. And in that whisper, I lived. I hadn't realized how deeply I had merged with the silence until I found myself watching the world move around me, as though I were a visitor. Everything I had once craved, validation, recognition, approval, now drifted past me like forgotten souvenirs of a different life. I didn't reach for them. I didn't mourn their absence. I simply let them go. There was power in that kind of surrender. Not weakness. Not apathy. But a conscious decision to detach from the parts of myself that had been too willing to break for others. I had spent so much of my life bending, stretching myself into shapes that made others comfortable. The revenge had cauterized those instincts. Now I was still, centered, untouched. But the world doesn't like stillness. It prods. It pokes. It asks questions, expecting stories. People wanted to know what had happened, why they had fallen so far, why the social tides had turned. The rumors swirled, growing out of control, twisting through communities like ivy. I listened, never speaking, never confirming. The truth had already done its work. I didn't need to add to it. They tried in their own way to reclaim some version of dignity. New projects. Forced smiles. Public apologies masked as statements of growth. But it was too late. Redemption doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when it's earned. And they had spent too long ignoring the wreckage they left behind. There was a desperation to their movements now. They clung to any attention, even negative. Anything to avoid the void of irrelevance. I watched from a distance, unseen but always present. Not for satisfaction, but for confirmation that the erosion hadn't just weakened the surface, but cracked something permanent beneath it. I received messages sometimes. Not directly from them, but from those circling their orbit. Apologies. Questions. Some trying to reconcile what had happened. Others fishing for answers. I responded to none. My silence had become its own language. And within it, I wrote my final chapters. There was a moment, brief, fleeting, where I wondered if I had gone too far. Not because they didn't deserve what happened, but because I questioned what it had cost me. In the pursuit of balance, had I let the fire consume parts of me that could never regrow? But even that doubt passed like a shadow on the wall, visible, but unable to touch me. Because I remembered. I remembered the nights I cried silently into my pillow while they laughed in someone else's arms. I remembered the way they spoke to me when they thought I had no choice but to stay. I remembered the gaslighting, the mockery, the subtle reminders that my worth was conditional. And I remembered the turning point. The exact moment when something inside me refused to break any further. That refusal became the seed of everything that followed. I was not cruel. I was not vindictive. I had simply become unwilling to carry their sins in my chest like weights. And so I returned them, one by one, until they had no choice but to wear them for all to see. They had underestimated me. Everyone had. I was the quiet one, the patient one, the one who forgave too easily, who listened more than she spoke, who absorbed betrayal like it was expected. But silence is not submission. Sometimes it's preparation. And now, I lived in that silence like a queen in her fortress, untouched, undisturbed. They had lost their footing in the world. Slowly, irrevocably. The invitation stopped. The congratulations turned to cautious nods. The admiration faded into discomfort. They could feel it. This invisible veil that now hung between them and the life they once ruled. And they couldn't name it, couldn't place it, because naming it would mean acknowledging me. And they wouldn't do that. Because to name me would be to admit that I had mattered. That I had been right. That the destruction they once inflicted had returned. Not as chaos, but as consequence. Their world grew smaller. They kept to themselves more. Their voice, once loud and self-assured, now trembled when they spoke in public. Not from fear of me. No, I had long vanished from their physical proximity, but from fear of what others might know, or suspect, or believe. Paranoia took root. They began questioning the motives of others, accusing friends of betrayal, pushing away the very people who might have helped them. But trust, once broken, leaves behind a residue. No matter how thoroughly you clean, the stain remains. And while they unraveled, I rebuilt, not just my life, but myself. I took long walks in places I used to avoid, reclaimed corners of the city I had once associated with pain. I met new people slowly, carefully, not out of loneliness, but out of curiosity. I learned the sound of my own laughter again. Not forced, not careful, just free. The revenge had run its course, but its impact lingered, not as a victory to celebrate, but as a scar I wore with quiet pride. A reminder of what I had survived, what I had conquered. Not them, myself. Because the real transformation didn't happen when their world fell apart. It happened when mine stopped needing them. I visited one of our old haunts once. Alone. I sat at the same table, ordered the same drink, stared at the same chipped wall we used to joke about. And I felt nothing. No nostalgia. No viternis. Just the clarity of distance. And in that moment I knew it was almost over. Not the revenge, but the hold they had on me. I didn't need to monitor their decline anymore. I didn't need to hear about their failures or witness their regret. I had crossed the threshold. I had exited the maze. They would carry their downfall with them forever. And I would carry the knowledge that I had never needed them to begin with. All that remained now was the closing chapter. There is a silence that follows victory, one that feels nothing like celebration. No music. No applause. Just a soft, steady exhale that fills the lungs with something unfamiliar. Peace. It came to me not in a dramatic moment, but in the mundane. A morning like any other, the sun brushing against the windows, the sound of water boiling, the weight of a blanket that no longer felt suffocating. That was when I realized it. Everything had ended. There was no final blow, no grand confrontation, no dramatic collapse before a crowd of spectators. The story had concluded not with a bang, but with a slow, undeniable fade. Their presence, once so large it eclipsed mine, had grown so faint I barely noticed it anymore. I didn't need proof of their ruin. I didn't crave their remorse. I didn't wait for closure they could never offer, because I had already given it to myself. I had carried anger like armor, worn grief like a second skin, but I no longer needed protection. The war was over. The walls I had built inside me, the ones that had guarded my heart, sharpened my focus, justified every calculated move, were no longer necessary. I could breathe again fully. I could walk without the weight of what they had done. The world didn't know. It never would. My revenge had been silent, surgical. No social spectacle, no scorched earth. Just 1,000 invisible cuts delivered over time, leaving no fingerprints but mine. And that was the beauty of it. They had destroyed me publicly. I had dismantled them in private. I still passed by the places we used to frequent. Occasionally I heard their name mentioned, followed by a pause, a discomfort people didn't know how to explain. Their legacy, once loud and polished, had eroded into a cautionary tale. Not a villain. Not a hero. Just a mistake no one wanted to repeat. And I had become untouchable, not because of fear, but because of restraint. I had kept my hands clean. I had never needed to scream. I let truth do the work for me. I gave time the rope and watched it loop itself. In that final season of reflection, I realized something unexpected. I didn't hate them anymore. What once burned inside me with sharp edges and poison thorns now lay dormant, like ash in an abandoned fireplace. I didn't forgive, but I no longer bled from the memory. And that, to me, was freedom. I revisited the versions of myself I had buried. The girl who believed in loyalty, the woman who offered too much, the silence that had been mistaken for weakness. I unearthed them one by one, not to resurrect them, but to acknowledge their sacrifice. Every part of me that had been shattered had served a purpose. And now every part deserved rest. I never told anyone what I had done. No need. The only person who needed to know was me. And I knew every detail. Every step. Every piece that had been pulled apart with precision. The revenge had not been for an audience. It had been for my own reckoning. They disappeared, eventually. Not physically, but socially, emotionally. They faded like old wallpaper under sunlight, still technically there, but irrelevant, ignored. People stopped mentioning them entirely, the way one forgets a song once loved, now replaced by something better. They became absence. And I lived. Not grandly, not flamboyantly, but fully. I pursued the passions I had set aside, not for performance, but for myself. I filled my days with creation, with movement, with intention. I surrounded myself with people who didn't need to be impressed, only understood. I learned to rest without guilt, to trust without condition, to speak without apology. There were nights when I lay awake, not out of unrest, but reflection. I would think about the path I had walked, the fire I had passed through, and how I had emerged untouched by the soot. I never wished it hadn't happened. It had carved me into something unbreakable. But I no longer needed to carry the blade. The final chapter came unexpectedly. A letter unsigned. The handwriting familiar but unsteady. There were no apologies, no admissions. Just a single sentence that read like an open wound. I never thought you could become what you did. I folded it once, then again, and placed it inside a book I hadn't read in years. I didn't need to respond. The letter wasn't for closure. It was a quiet confession, one they could never say aloud, and I could never forget. That was their ending, not mine. My ending had no letter, no confession, no memorial, only freedom. And so I walked forward, carrying only what mattered. Strength without bitterness, memory without grief, power without cruelty. I had become my own shelter, my own storm, my own silence. And in that silence, I wore my crown, not of gold, not of vengeance but of survival.